Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at the second half of Chapter 8, and this will focus on a lot of the battles and the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. Okay, so General Washington base. So we left off around Boston. Eventually, British troops evacuate from Boston in March of '76, and then they head on to New York City. And the strategy there is by taking New York, they can cut off New England and the South, and kind of isolate these two sides and take them out one by one. So kind of breaking up the supply lines between North and South by cutting into New York City. And so they show up with 500 ships, this giant navy that we've never seen before, 32,000 British soldiers, an army. We've never seen anything that big. And so soldiers and Hessians arrive in New York City and take it very quickly by 1776. They picked New York City in particular because there's a lot of Loyalist supporters there. It was centrally located for the harbor, so it's right there, so it's a nice place to park your navy, great place for the Loyalists. Washington's 18,000 men is all he's got left at this point, 18 versus 32,000, those are not good odds. His men are sick, a lot of them have been killed, deserted, or captured. They really needed a win after this pretty bad loss of one of their big cities. This picture depicts kind of a few months before, as soon as independence was declared, a lot of the Americans and patriots in New York City celebrated by tearing down the statue of King George. And so they tear down the statue, they cut the head off, and they take the rest of the statue and they turn it into bullets. And apparently later on the head is returned to England, but most of it was turned into bullets, which were given back to the British soldiers. But they were outnumbered, so there were more Loyalists in New York City in this case. And so Washington desperately needed to win, so he runs out of New York City off to New Jersey. And speaking of New York, named known as Nathan Hale, he was an American spy caught gathering intelligence in New York, and so he was kind of trying to get information from the British troops there, but because he was caught, he was executed by the British Army. And his last words were, "I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country." And so you can go to Yale, and at Yale, where he was a student, the class of '73, you can see where his dorm was. The building is still there, and there's a statue of him right next to it. And right next to it is a former student of mine, Vivian Arroyo, class of 2014, who was a history major over there. So, yeah, bring it, step up. Battle of Trenton. And so after escaping from New York, his army really need to win. They may not survive the winter because their morale is so low. And so they're chased from New York, and they decide they need something. They need some type of win. The British don't continue the chase. If the British continue the chase, they might have defeated Washington at that point, war's over, but they decide to set up camp for the winter. It's just too risky to march around during the winter because if your soldiers get frostbite, more guys are going to get sick, and then what you would win. And so it's just too much of a risk. But Washington needs to take that risk. He needs a win. And so Christmas night of 1776, Washington and his men cross the Delaware River into New Jersey. They get really lucky, and they capture 1,000 German troops. And 1 week later, with a little more trickery, and by attacking during the winter, which is not suspected, he beats them again at Princeton a week later. And so this is a little painting depicting that, although this painting was painted 100 years later, and nobody would have been standing like that in the boat, but it's a nice painting nonetheless, painted by a German guy who really had no experience in America, but it looks nice. So William Howe, he's out of New York City at this point. He's looking for Washington, finds him at Brandywine, Pennsylvania in the summer of '77, which opens up an attack on Philadelphia. So the British take our capital city at Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress runs away. So we're not doing too well. We've lost New York City, and we've lost Philadelphia, and we're losing a lot of other major cities, so we really need a win. It's looking pretty bad. Luckily for the Americans, we don't have one giant city that if you take out city, it's all going to fall apart. We don't have a London or Paris. If you take out New York, we survive, and we can just move on. And so that's really it's going to be one of our strengths in this war, and that we just, if we lose a city, we keep moving on. We don't have one city to rule them all, the way a lot of other countries do. And so we lose our capital, we lose Independence Hall, but we keep fighting. And it's Saratoga that is the victory that we really need. This is a battle to know. And so General John Burgoyne leads the British and their allies south from Canada. They take, it's kind of a tough march through a lot of forest. The American army is chopping down a lot of that forest to kind of slow them down and block off the roads. Benedict Arnold slows down the troops as well with some light naval battles in the lakes. But eventually he does lose overall and loses his army. He's surrounded at Saratoga in New York and surrenders to General Horatio Gates. So it's a nice win. This is where the army is actually standing up face to face. No sneaky tactics here. In this case, we won. And it's a major turning point in that at this point, England realizes we should probably get out of this thing. So England offers home rule. The whole thing that we've been asking for all along, where we get to have our own government. The king is still technically in charge, but Americans would get to have their own government, which is just a step shy of independence. However, it's a little too late for that. We want independence. We want the whole thing. Home rule is not going to be enough. If he offered that in 1776, before July 4th, we might have taken the deal. But too late. So we're going to go with the fight. Since 1775, the French had been secretly sending in weapons to the colonists because we really didn't have the ability to make our own weapons. So we were getting in secret weapons to help this fight. We send over Ben Franklin as one of our top diplomats and party animals to go over to France. And he's going to stay there to really seal that alliance with the French from 1776 to 1785. And so he seals and really creates this alliance. Adams is also sent over there, but Adams does not do as well and eventually has to go home. And we send him to other places. So finally, because of this battle, because we're able to stand up and really win in a real battle without any tricks, the French formally recognize American independence, and they're going to fight England until England recognizes that independence too. For the rest of this war, France is going to supply half of the soldiers and all of their navy to defend America. We don't really have much of a navy, so they set up our navy. And they send over their troops. And without France, this would have been a much different war. UK, at this point, retreats from Philadelphia to concentrate all their forces in New York to protect the Navy, because the French Navy is on its way. The French were worried that the British would try to take their Caribbean possessions, especially Haiti, because Haiti was one of the biggest money-making colonies. And so they're going to send over their Navy to really protect their colonies from the British. The Spanish and the Dutch also join against Britain, as kind of this is their big chance, and so here's some of the Spanish troops. And so it's much bigger than what England had anticipated, and the British Navy is now outnumbered. So alone, the British Navy dominates, but when you throw in the French and the Spanish and the Dutch, they're outnumbered all of a sudden. It's starting to turn against the English. Some more of the fights. 1780, the French army arrived with 6,000 troops in Rhode Island under the command of Comte de Rochambeau. And so that's kind of an upswing in that we've got this army here, it's getting better. And then we take a hit. 1780, our top general, one of our best guys, Benedict Arnold, attempts to give West Point to the British, one of our key forts, to really control the state of New York. He tries to give that away to the British for cash, about 6,000 pounds worth of cash, and a position as an officer in the British Army. But we figure out what's happening before it's too late, and he runs away to British lines. The new British strategy at this point is to focus on the South, where Loyalist support is very strong. There's a lot of evangelical support. Not evangelical, but Anglican support, I meant. In 1778, the British take and roll straight through Georgia. 1780, the British armies arrived to take Charlestown, South Carolina. It's their biggest victory in the war. Charlestown was a key port, a lot of money, a lot of ships going through this town. So if you take this, you're going to make a lot of money, and you're going to hurt the Americans' ability to make money. They take out 5,000 U.S. soldiers, 400 cannons by taking Charlestown. So it's a big victory for them. It really hurts for the Americans, and it's going to hurt our trade. And so the main guy leading this is going to be Commander Cornwallis, smashing through South Carolina. After he smashes through the South and does very, very well, he tries to take Virginia doesn't do as well, so he's going to take a little break at Yorktown until new supplies come in, and he's expecting the English Navy to be strong enough to send in supplies. He doesn't realize how strong the French Navy is going to be. Speaking of the Navy, we don't have much of one, besides whatever the French would give us, so mostly it was just a few ships here and there with some really daring captains. One of the more famous ones is a Scotsman, a guy from Scotland, John Paul Jones, who, here are two images. So this little statue is of what he actually looked like, and then we've got British propaganda here, Paul Jones the Pirate. And so he's seen as a big naval hero for us, but for the British, this guy was pretty vicious. One of his most famous quotes is, as his ship is sinking and everything's falling apart around him, he says, "I have not yet begun to fight," and is able to actually win the battle. And as his ship is sinking, he jumps onto the next ship and takes over and wins, and continues to fight another day. But the actual Navy for the Americans doesn't do much. We don't really make a dent in the British Navy. And when it comes to battleship to battleship, we don't do well. We're much better at being pirates. And so the Congress approves 1,000 American privateers, 1,000 American ships, to go out and attempt to harass and steal from the other British ships. And so these are legal pirates approved by Congress, with 70,000 sailors that are just going to go around and try to steal from English ships and just kind of gather around the English Isle and just steal from whatever we can. And so this brings in a lot of gold for the U.S., and that's part of the deal, in that they are given permission to become pirates as long as we get part of the money. And so this brings in gold to help fund the war, and it really hurts British trade in that it's not only bringing us gold, it's taking gold away from the English, and it's hurting English business and trade, and they're trying to sell things that keep getting stolen by the Americans. And so eventually a lot of the English businessmen start to put pressure on Parliament saying, "Hey, how about you end this war so we can start making money again? This is getting annoying." And so that's another strategy to end this thing. But the big battle is Yorktown that really finished this thing off. And so Cornwallis is waiting at this little village, Yorktown, Virginia, for supplies to come in from the ocean. And we decide, hey, he's vulnerable, he's stuck in this little town, let's surround him. Especially with the French Navy. So the French Navy swoops up from their island in Haiti and decide to attack. And so we've got land troops and the Navy, and it's a perfect combination to surround this pretty tough general. And so we cut off the English Navy by blockading Chesapeake Bay so they can't get in. And so there's no supplies, no reinforcements are going to come in to help this guy. And then we surround him on this side, so he can't just cross the water here. And the French surround here, the Americans surround here. And for the next 3 weeks, we slowly dig trenches, slowly get closer and closer and closer until we're right up against the town. And so for 3 weeks, we are just lobbing cannonballs into the city. Non-stop 3 weeks of just bombing the city, digging trenches closer and closer and closer until eventually he's surrounded. Most of the houses have been knocked down. There's nowhere to go by land or sea. So after 3 weeks of being bombed, he surrenders to the Americans and French forces and is back off to England, where he's definitely going to get a demotion. His next job is actually to go work in India. That's not the end of the war. There are a couple minor battles here and there, but it does really trigger negotiations. So it triggers the talks that end the war. But for one more year, we've got a couple minor battles here and there. Washington will surround the UK troops in New York and start to squeeze in closer and closer. And we'll get small battles between patriots and loyalist troops in the South, but nothing too big. Also, right after this battle, Parliament switches from a Tory to a Whig majority, so they have an election. They get rid of the party that really supported the king and led by Prime Minister Lord North, and so his party is out of favor. The Whig party is in favor, which is kind of the anti, or at least a little bit against the king party, and more for the Americans. And so Parliament is ready to end this thing. Business is ready to end this thing. The Americans are ready to end this thing. So finally, everybody's going to get the king to agree it's over. And so we have peace talks in Paris. with the United States, Britain, France, and Spain. And we send our best negotiators, John Adams, to look out for the interests of the North, Ben Franklin, and because he's such a good diplomat, in addition to John Jay, who's going to be one of our top diplomats for the next few years, a great Secretary of State. As far as what do we get out of this deal? And so September 1783, we sign this deal, war's over, and England declares that the Americans are independent, and this confirms our independence for a little while until they make a comeback in 1812. This sets the boundaries, and so we do get a little chunk of extra land past the mountains here, past the Allegheny Mountains. We get this little extra chunk of land, which we were nervous about, that chunk of land might have gone to France or Spain, but England didn't want to see that land go to them, so we get this nice chunk of land. We ignore Native American rights. The battle is because they were not, Native Americans weren't part of the treaty. The war actually continues for a couple years to take off the tribes one by one, and I'll talk about that next time. We promised that Americans would repay any war debts that we had. We also promised not to harass the Loyalists, even though we do. However, we don't actually set a date for the British soldiers to evacuate the U.S. So in many cases, they just kind of sit in the corner and they wait along the borders for the round 2 War of 1812. But we'll stop there and take a look at the effects of the revolution later on.